There are no horns on the demon. He arrives with a plan, a grin, and phony receipts that are brimming with compliments. They believe they had you. Perhaps, but most likely not. They even chose the outfits they would wear to bring you down since they were so confident in themselves. They were unaware, however, that a selected individual would not heedlessly tumble into a trap. The selected one looks at the path that leads to the trap. You can help spread God's blessings by clicking the Super Thanks button on YouTube and contributing $20 or more. They study the unseen ink printed between each word, feeling the force behind it. You witnessed everything. The tone shift, the scripted politeness, the extravagant offerings, the unexpected attention, the odd coincidences. Everything was expertly constructed by them. However, you read the spirit of the presentation rather than the actual presentation. Here's an intriguing fact. Research in psychology indicates that people who have a high degree of empathy are frequently skilled at spotting lies. Their ability to discern emotional changes and microexpressions that others miss is what makes them paranoid, not crazy. They thus had the incorrect attitude and played the wrong game. And they're angry now. Why? Because they didn't just fail with their strategy. In front of everyone, it failed. They were depending on your tears, your bewilderment, and your quiet. Instead, you provided them with peace, clarity, and that frightful smile that said, "I saw you coming." So, hold on tight, because we'll examine the spiritual scheme of treachery, the trap set up to harm you, and how you flipped it like a reverse Uno card from heaven in this video. We won't sugarcoat anything, so don't worry. This isn't sugar. It's fire. Let's begin. They initially mistook your compassion for foolishness. In actual time, however, you were reading the plan. They mistook your compassion for foolishness. Because you listened more than you talked, they assumed you were unaware of what was happening. They believed you to be sluggish, innocent, and easily swayed since they could see you respected people and didn't treat them suspiciously. However, they were unaware that you were following everything with your soul as well as your ears. You were taking in all the patterns, inconsistencies, odd energy shifts, phony smiles, and sidelong glances as they were on stage, lying and plotting behind your back. Nothing was unknown to you. You were collecting evidence in secret, and since you delayed exposing them, they believed they had you under control. However, you witnessed everything. They meant what they said, not simply what they said. Not just what they did, but also why they did it. You weren't sentimental. In real time, you were resolving the spiritual conflict. They were unaware that you weren't confused by your quiet. You were strategic. The long game was what you were doing. You had no intention of proving them incorrect or winning the debate. You knew that if you approached them too quickly, they would deny it, distort the tale, and make you appear insane. So you let them go more into their own swamp. Thus, you waited. You observed. You grinned. You gave them the impression that they were winning. They observed how you behaved. You saw into their souls. They are now upset because of this. Because you didn't simply reveal a little falsehood when you eventually took action and ripped back the curtain. The entire apparatus they put in place to trick you was exposed by you. And the collapse wasn't spectacular. It wasn't retaliation. It was surgical, peaceful, and clean. Your punch was so lethal because of the gentleness they saw as weakness. Because it's too late to reverse the situation when the selected one eventually tells the truth. Because you didn't respond the way they expected you to, they assumed you were foolish. However, you weren't a moron. They were 5 steps behind you. And they're not only embarrassed now that they know you know everything. They're terrified. They wonder what more you've seen and what else you're keeping to yourself if you've come to this realization. Second, you give them time to complete their setup. Thus, they are unable to avoid exposure. You allowed them to finish their setup because you knew everything, not because you didn't know. You watched as their plan came to pass. And you watched everything unfold rather than intervening to stop them. They believed you to be blind. They believed they had you imprisoned. However, you allowed them to continue even though you knew exactly what they were doing. Why? Because you had knowledge that others did not. To be disclosed, it had to be finished. They would have played the fool, denied everything, and changed the tale if you had exposed them too soon. They would have accused you of being theatrical or neurotic. Worst of all, they would have escaped punishment once more. You gave them the impression that they were winning. You allowed them to take off their masks entirely. You allowed them to lay the trap so well that they were unable to get out when the truth was revealed. You witnessed their coordination, phony worries, coerced generosity, and unexpected interest in your life. You were aware of its falsity. You saw how their body language didn't match the fire behind their remarks. And you said nothing rather than face it. The movie wasn't interrupted by you. You knew that the more rope you gave them, the more they would sink, so you let it all happen. They are now unable to explain it. It's too deliberate, too clear, and too detailed. They are unable to wipe their filthy hands. They are furious because their schemes have failed, but they also recognize that you have been seeing them like an indestructible mirror from the beginning to the end. They ended up putting themselves in the spotlight while they were laying the groundwork to see your demise. Fortunately, you avoided the trap. You allowed them to set the trap for themselves. Additionally, they were unprepared for the fact that you had already made the decision to depart when the trap fell. It's what makes them crazy. You did not respond. You didn't plead. You didn't struggle to remain. You left in a certain manner, while others stood there feeling a sense of remorse they were unable to articulate. They have no control over the tale and no way to remove the evidence. Third, although you are no longer that person, the trap was still set up the same way. They didn't set the trap for you at random. It was created according to their perception of you. The one who put up with rudeness because you were so in need of affection. The one who kept quiet in order to maintain harmony. The one who didn't want to start anew. Therefore, they disregarded the warning flags. They were going after that individual. You can help spread God's blessings by clicking the Super Thanks button on YouTube and contributing $20 or more. They used that version of you to prepare their traps. However, there is a single issue. You got away from that somebody without notifying them. They looked at your history rather than your present. They were unaware of your growth behind their backs. They had no idea that the suffering they inflicted was what made you recognize them for what they truly were. You have gone through too much to repeat the same mistakes. You were living with a more modern capacity for reasoning, more robust limits, and a mindset that was impervious to manipulation by flattering words or well-known faces. While they were formulating plans based on outdated information, they believed that by using the same strategies, false promises, shame, phony loyalty, or trauma bonds, they might trick you once more. They believed that you would return to your former self in order to be accepted if they brought back memories of you. However, you didn't. Even if it meant separating from individuals you previously would have sacrificed your life to keep, you kept growing. And all came apart when you didn't respond as they had anticipated. They expected you to be extremely sympathetic, overly forgiving, and emotionally sensitive. They had faith that you would take responsibility, question your gut, and explain yourself in order to make things right. However, that individual is no longer present. That's why their strategy didn't work out. They put up a ghost trap. How about you? It became out that they could never control you. They're perplexed now, not just furious. They're sitting in the ruins of the scheme they devised to ruin you, wondering how it all went wrong. But they know the truth in their hearts. Since you are no longer that person, you avoided falling into the trap. You were saved by growing up and maturing, and you were protected from falling into their trap by God's hand in your life and the power you subtly developed in the shadows. Fourth, you employed what they didn't know about you as a weapon, while they used what they did know. They employed their knowledge of you as a weapon. Like bullets, they exploited fragments of your history, your fears, your childhood traumas, the times you trusted too readily, and the errors you made because you were naive. They attempted to use all of that as a basis for a plan. They believed that you would respond similarly if they applied pressure to the identical wounds. That was what they depended on. They counted on your emotional reactions, which were predictable. They mentioned the dysfunction, the quiet, and the abandonment in your family's past. They believed that by mirroring these patterns, you would numb yourself once more. They looked at your attachment style, your phobias, and your emotional routines. Then, they exploited the components that broke under strain to construct a trap. However, they were surprised to learn that you also looked at yourself. More profoundly, you did it for healing rather than manipulation. You were busy changing into the version of yourself that doesn't require their apology, while they were obsessed with the version of you that begs for closure. They believed that you still required their love, support, and approval. However, they failed to recognize that you had established a quiet foundation with God. You began walking with purpose instead of circling in circles. Since they were simply seeing your behavior and not your spirit, they were unable to see this shift. You added something they never worked on to the script: your self-awareness, discernment, and energy sensing skills. The fact that you can now be correct without arguing. The reality that you now listen with your soul as well as your ears. This was unexpected. They were prepared for combat. You brought tranquility. Drama was what they were prepared for. You remained silent in response. A quiet that scared people who couldn't manage you, not one that was weak. They applied what they believed to be their knowledge, with what they never cared to learn. However, you prevailed. The roar of its return was devoid of power. It existed in its serenity. Everything they didn't take the time to look at was undervalued. They made weapons for this reason, but they were unsuccessful. Fifth, your intelligence wasn't enough to beat them. Behind them, you revealed the puppet masters. Your intelligence wasn't enough to defeat the individuals in front of you. You delved more deeper than they anticipated. You traced the threads to their origin while they were busy attempting to distract you, trap you, or manipulate your emotions. Eliminating unhealthy relationships and avoiding drama weren't the only goals here. It was about the ultimate kind of discernment. You were blind to their actions. Who was behind it was visible to you. They were pretty well-planned maneuvers. The timing was quite precise. The patterns were recognizable. The spiritual traces were apparent to you. Conversations sounded strange at times. Some individuals continued to arrive with the same blank script at critical times. Individuals weren't the only ones targeting you. Something greater was testing you. And you kept quiet and saw the plan come to pass as the majority of people gave in to feelings of betrayal. Some of these folks weren't thinking for themselves, and you started to see that. They were under mental control and being utilized. They were performing commands they did not completely comprehend, whether via spiritual links, generations-old fortifications, sorcery, or inherited obligations. They were pawns in the hands of powers who had spent years researching your family history. The attacks seemed very personal because of this. They knew just where to attack because of this. But everything changed here. You ceased responding and began to watch. You started to recognize the purpose behind the insults and stopped focusing on them. And the mask dropped as you did. You witnessed the spirit of surveillance, the envy, the sabotage, the controllers, and the unseen forces. The actual adversary has been captured. You also didn't give up. You understood that this was more than a relationship problem. In human form, it was a spiritual conflict. You stopped defending yourself after that. You gave up on attempting to fix unfixable individuals. You started praying strategically, declared war, and left guilt-free. You didn't just get away from their manipulation. The whole energy network working in the background was made public by you. Since you didn't fall, they are no longer upset. They are scared since they saw the puppeteer, and the game is ended when you see the puppeteer. They are aware that you witnessed everything. Sixth, you had the script before opening night, yet they still gave a flawless performance. They genuinely believed they had deceived you. They practiced every word they spoke. Every action was timed. Every action, facial expression, and worry was a part of a well-planned show. He was portraying the victim, the hero, the buddy, and the supporter, and he was doing it rather effectively. He pretended to be protecting you behind the scenes while guiding you to failure, and it undoubtedly appeared plausible to all onlookers. They were unaware, however, that you had previously read the script. Even before the first syllable was said, you could see the treachery coming. Everything had previously been subtly shown to you by the Holy Spirit through dreams, intuition, your soul, and abrupt shifts that you couldn't ignore. Although there was first no tangible proof, the spiritual confirmation was evident and obvious. Thus, you waited and observed. You weren't shocked when the falsehoods started to come to light. When individuals abruptly abandoned you or distorted your remarks, you weren't taken by surprise. It was already visible to you. You were previously aware of the outcome. All you did was let it happen. It's not that you were weak, but that you let them fully express themselves. You were aware that they would take advantage of the situation if you reacted too quickly. You can help spread God's blessings by clicking the Super Thanks button on YouTube and contributing $20 or more. For this reason, you provided them with the stage, the audience, and the opportunity to finish their story. The stage props, phony proof, fabricated messages, and deceptive speeches were all created by them. You didn't have to defend yourself since the truth would surface on its own, despite their attempts to control the narrative. Additionally, you realized something crucial. It was not your responsibility to stop the play when God gave you foreknowledge. It was to let the performance to finish so that justice could collect all the necessary evidence. On their stage, you never belonged. You disassociated yourself from the writing as soon as you saw it. You emotionally left the stage while they still believed they could keep your interest. And you didn't cheer when the last scene was shown. You didn't weep. You knew how it would end, so you walked off the stage without a word. You also stopped letting people try out for parts in a narrative that wasn't written by God. Seventh, you let the snake get close so you could carefully chop off its head. The moment change started, you were fully aware of what was taking place. The tone changed. The vibe became odd. The quiet turned suspicious. You could feel treachery coming. You had a certain spiritual awareness that could not be taught, not because you were paranoid. However, you did something unexpected for them rather than responding. You didn't move. You gave them permission to approach. You gave them the impression that you knew nothing. You gave them the impression that you were precisely where they wanted you to be. They saw your silence as a sign of weakness. Your quiet was not fear, despite what they believed. The moment was right. You weren't acting out of emotion. You were strategic. You saw their actions, deceptions, and covert coordination with others. Without a word, you did as you were told. You were waiting for the right opportunity to strike, while they believed they were tying you more firmly into their schemes. Most people don't understand what you did. Being the first to react isn't the point. Isn't hitting the point? You didn't have to reveal them too soon. The truth came out without you having to yell or plead. You waited for the trap to be revealed. The evidence was indisputable, and the pattern was unquestionable. Then you took unexpected, swift, and decisive action. They were caught off guard. They were shaken by that. You changed everything in a matter of seconds. You demolished all they had created in secrecy with one move. Because you were formulating your plan while they trusted your feelings. You weren't in bed. You were observing. And you addressed the issue at its core when the time was appropriate. Since they believed they had more time, they are now bewildered, embarrassed, and in a panic. They believe they could keep playing roles, controlling you, and slinking under your nose. However, you purposefully drew the snake nearer so that you could precisely kill it rather than amuse it. You weren't angry when you attacked. You launched an enlightened attack. And because they know the truth in their hearts, this makes the suffering even worse. You never remained unaware. You gave them permission to enter the light, where all would become clear. The eighth number. They relied on your generosity to keep you quiet. However, you put heavenly justice ahead of public approval. They believed you wouldn't talk. They were certain that your generosity would prevent you from speaking. They believed that in order to maintain harmony, avoid confrontation, and safeguard their reputation, you would remain silent. And you did for a time. You eliminated any possibility. You chose to disregard what happened. You convinced yourself that making a scene wasn't worth it. You didn't want to ruin anything, so you hid secrets that weren't yours. Peace, however, was not what you were defending. It was their picture, and you knew it in your heart. You sensed it in your soul each time you kept quiet to save other people's feelings. They continued their evil activities by hiding behind your generosity and using your quiet as a shield. They believed that because you were so devoted, kind, and Christian, you would never accuse them. They made a mistake there since you didn't just hit your breaking point. A spiritual awakening came to you. You came to see that you were not made by God to bring about peace. You were made to be a truth-bearer by Him. You become evil's silent ally when you defend it in silence. The realization of this fact rocked you to your core. And then everything was different. You lost interest in preserving their reputation. You stopped defending those who would never defend you in return. You started standing in divine harmony and stopped submitting to false loyalty. They were overcome by terror at that point as they were unable to utilize guilt to dominate you. They were no longer able to use false love to control you. Your silence was no longer an excuse for them. It rocked them to their core when you began to choose justice over hypocrisy, obedience over appearance, and truth over comfort. Not because you exposed them in retaliation, but rather because you did it with God-given clarity, composure, and confidence. You refrained from attacking. You didn't strike back. You let the light do what it usually does and stood on the side of righteousness. What should never have been concealed was revealed by you. You spoke, even if they weren't expecting it. It wasn't a booming voice, either. It made sense. That struck them most forcefully. You didn't ruin their reputation. The truth itself did. Point 9. They attempted to elicit a response, but you revealed their actual nature. They exerted every effort to undermine you. They reopened old scars, raised delicate subjects, engaged in passive assault, and even made an attempt to mockingly degrade you in public. They wanted you to blow up. Their intention was to elicit a reaction from you and use that emotion as a weapon, not to do you physical harm. See, that's their true face. They needed a stage, and they wanted you to lose control so they could point at you. They required pandemonium. They constructed a tale behind your back and required you to play the antagonist. However, you failed to provide them with what they desired. The pressure was felt by you. The trap was visible to you. But you didn't move. Instead of reacting, you maintained your equilibrium. You allow your composure and stillness to speak louder than any angry outburst. You can help spread God's blessings by clicking the Super Thanks button on YouTube and contributing $20 or more. They weren't ready for your peace, and that's what won them over. They believed they knew what would set you off. They were unaware that mending was preventing them from participating in the game. They were unaware that your self-control was a technique rather than a kind of repression. Fear wasn't causing you to back down. Since you were fully aware of their intentions, you were preventing yourself from moving on. You wouldn't provide them an easy way to fabricate a story. Their actions started to seem suspect when you maintained your composure and spoke politely rather than angrily. Everything changed at that point. Your composure turned into a mirror. All of a sudden, everyone in their immediate vicinity could see the small strategies they were employing. They unraveled more the more composed you stayed. Their voice grew rougher. Their tales began to conflict with one another. They began to remove their masks. And what was to be revealed about you was revealed about them. People may now see who they really are. You let them show themselves, not because you exposed them with your words. Their weakness was shown by your restraint. That moment wasn't your only victory.